All right, good morning, seniors. It is Thursday morning. The clock is over there. 9:45. I'm gonna go over chapters 11 through 15 with you in this review video. Um, so it's the creature that Dr. Frankenstein has made, and I really like these chapters because he's fully grown when he awakens. But he goes through and it sort of explains his education and how he learned to even feel and perceive things. So it's really interesting, and I think Mary Shelley does a good job of imagining how that might be like to wake up fully grown and gradually learn hey, I'm the only one of myself, which sucks. So the creature has an existential crisis, basically, in these chapters. So he learns to use his eyes. He describes the process of blinking for the first time, of learning what the sun and the moon is and seasons. He discovers fire. He hears birds and thinks they sound beautiful, and he tries himself to speak. But he says, the uncouth and inarticulate sounds which broke from me frightened me into silence again. So he can't even use his voice yet. My eyes became accustomed to the light and to perceive objects in their right form. I distinguished the insect from the herb, and by degrees one herb from another. Different types of birds. And here, right after this, he learns how to... or not how to make fire, but he discovers fire, and he's like, hey, this is pretty cool. And we might connect that to Prometheus, the god, or the Titan, who gave man fire, and Zeus was all pissed off, and he made him, chained him to a cliff and let vultures eat his liver. But it's very much this chapter of discovery of the physical senses. He goes into a village. Doesn't end well for him. Let's see. First an old man shrieks, and then he goes into a home. The children shrieked, and one of the women fainted. The whole village was roused. Some fled, some attacked me, until, grievously bruised by stones and many other kinds of missile weapons, I escaped to the open country, and fearfully took refuge in a low hovel. So this is the place where he ends up staying throughout the rest of these chapters. This sort of little shed type shelter connected to another village, or not a village, but another cottage where 3 people live. And he watches these people through a little crack in the wood. So there's a girl. We'll learn their names. A young man, and then an older man who is their father. And there's a really pretty quote. So he's just discerned physical senses so far, but then he says he's watching the old man play, I assume maybe the violin, for his daughter, and he observes, he raised her and smiled with such kindness and affection that I felt sensations of a peculiar and overpowering nature. They were a mixture of pain and pleasure, such as I had never before experienced, either from hunger or cold, warmth or food, and I withdrew from the window, unable to bear these emotions. So this is the first time he sort of sees, or is exposed to human emotions, and it's really overwhelming to him. And he sort of which, to be overwhelmed by this, you have to sort of assume that he has the capacity for these emotions himself, right? If they affect him so much. Yeah, he watches them. The sun reads aloud at night. He doesn't know what reading is yet, but he will. Okay, so chapter 12. He stays, he watches, he learns their routine, and he learns what makes this family so happy. He writes, it was poverty. They grow their own food. They're totally self-sustaining, but they're not well off. He's been eating their food, stealing their food, but when he sees that this is sort of causing them trouble, this is one of the ways that he helps the family out. He stops, finds his own food, does chores for this family, various chores, and I want you guys to read and figure out what those chores are, because that's a question. But he helps them out. He perceives that they communicate through speech. I found that these people possessed a method of communicating their experience and feelings to one another by articulate sounds. I perceived that the words they spoke sometimes produced pleasure or pain, smiles or sadness in the minds and countenances of the hearers. Countenance, again, means face. We had that word in Othello. So he really becomes attached to these people just watching them. He learns their names. Agatha is the daughter. Felix is the son. And father, who we later learned is de Lacy, right? It's French. Okay. He learns what reading is, that there's like symbols to communicate speech. So he's like, that's pretty cool. But he writes, I perceive that, although I eagerly longed to discover myself to the cottagers, I ought not to make the attempt until I had first become master of their language, which knowledge might enable me to make them overlook the deformity of my figure. So he resolves to learn language before he sort of goes and reveals himself to the cottagers, because the more he watches them, the more he recognizes in his own life, like, hey, I don't have family, I don't have society, I don't belong. And he knows it's because of how he looks. Doing more chores. Yeah. Chapter 13. Safi comes. She's originally from the Middle East, and I think we learn that in the next chapter. But Felix is teaching her, she speaks a different language, and he's really enchanted by her singing. But Felix is teaching her to read, to learn their language. The creature notes, she was endeavoring to learn their language, and the idea instantly occurred to me that I should make use of the same instructions to the same end. So, conveniently, he's able to learn French from scratch, because these people speak French. Yeah, and that's his education. Reads from the book The Ruin of Empires, learns a lot of history and about ancient cultures. And he's sort of awestruck by the nature of humankind. He questions, was man indeed at once so powerful, so virtuous and magnificent, yet so vicious and base? So he's learning like how ambiguous human nature is, how good humans can be and bad it can be, and he's just very overwhelmed by this knowledge. He learns of the division of property, of immense wealth and squalid poverty, of rank, descent, and noble blood. So how people categorize themselves into society, or how people are categorized, because we don't always decide, or rarely do we decide. And again, this causes him only to think more about, like, what am I? Like, I don't fit into any of these things. And once he learns this, he says, of what a strange nature is knowledge. It clings to the mind when it has once seized on it, like a lichen on the rock. So just the more he learns, the more he suffers and wonders, like, why am I an outcast? So that quote essentially is another way of saying ignorance is bliss for him. Yeah, and again, what was I? The question again recurred, to be answered only with groans. No friends and family. Okay, chapter 19. This tells how the family ended up in poverty, because they were a wealthy French family. Safi's father, Felix, just happened to be at a court trial. And Safi's father was really unjustly condemned to death because he was not a member of that society. It was judged that his religion and wealth, rather than the crime alleged against him, had been the cause of his condemnation. So he's very successful, but he's a Middle Easterner, so he's not part of this society. And Felix is like, what the heck? Like, that's so unfair. Didn't know the guy, but he goes to meet him and makes this plan to break him out of jail, which he does. Meets his daughter, and his daughter is Safi, and she's sort of the motivator of this, because this Safi's father's like, if you help me, you can marry my daughter. And Safi really likes this idea because, and there's a little bit of xenophobia here from Mary Shelley when she talks about Asians in general. But we can tell that the father comes from a strict Islamic background. Muhammad. And so Safi's mother was a Christian, and so she's experienced this other culture, and she much prefers it. Shelley writes, the prospect of marrying a Christian and remaining in a country where women were allowed to take a rank in society was enchanting to her. So Safi wants to stay in Europe in this culture. She fears that if she goes back to Asia, she will be sort of condemned because of her sex. But the French government discovers that Felix helped this man. He throws Agatha and de Lacy, his father, into jail, and Felix is forced to return back to Paris to help them. And meanwhile, Safi's father's like, well, I never was going to let you marry Felix anyway. So they leave. They go. They're in Italy at this point, but then they leave and go somewhere else. And meanwhile, back in France, they are imprisoned for 5 months, lose their fortune, and then sent into exile. And that's how they ended up in this cottage in Germany. But meanwhile, Safi has escaped from her father, and brought this woman along to accompany her, found out where Felix lives. The woman accompanying her dies, but finally she makes it to Felix. So, kind of a long, convoluted plot, but there you have it. Okay, chapter 20. He's still doing favors for the family. Out on one of his outings, he finds some books and he reads, and he becomes even more philosophical. Who was I? What was I? Whence did I come? What was my destination? These questions continually reoccurred, but I was unable to solve them. So he reads 3 different books: Paradise Lost, something by the Greek writer Plutarch, and Sorrows of Werther, which I've never heard of that last one. But he becomes, he's furthering his education, right? And Paradise Lost is the one that stands out to me, maybe because I know it the best of the 3. But this is where we've seen the creature use this comparison of himself to Adam and himself to Satan and Victor Frankenstein to being his creator, his God. And this is where he's learned of all this stuff. So So he's reflecting on this. Like Adam, I was apparently united by no link to any other being in existence. He had come forth from the hands of a god, a perfect creature, happy and prosperous, guarded by the especial care of his creator. He was allowed to converse with and acquire knowledge from beings of a superior nature. But I was wretched, helpless, and alone. Many times I considered Satan as the fitter emblem of my condition. For often, like him, when I viewed the bliss of my protectors, the bitter gall of envy rose within me. So again, he's thinking of his creation, saying like Adam was created by God, cared for by God. I was created and cast out. So there's really like, even in literature, he's like, I might be like Satan, but even in literature, he's understanding like there is no model for my existence. Like I am utterly alone. Which would be a crazy realization to come to, right? Then, finally, now that he can read, he has this journal of Victor Frankenstein's that was in the coat he stole when he left the night that Victor created him and he woke up. And he's reading about his existence. And how much he's just sort of horrified by this. God in pity made man beautiful and alluring after his own image, but my form is a filthy type of yours, more horrid even from the very resemblance. So he's sort of disgusted by how he's been created. And he makes this plan he furthers this plan to go and reveal himself to the cottagers. I persuaded myself that when they should become acquainted with my admiration of their virtues, they would compassionate me and overlook my personal deformity. So he's watched them. He knows they're good people. He thinks they will sort of take him under their wing. But he needs to read more first. He sits through autumn, winter. You guys can read that. And finally he makes his move. And he's determined to address DeLacy when the children are gone because he's blind. And he can speak to DeLacy without that, without him having, there's a quote for it. But it, you guys know what I'm saying. It removes that level of judgment from him. So DeLacy can only hear him. And the creature hopes that DeLacy recognizes in him a good person that is worthy of love. So he goes up and he's like, hey, I have this family, but they're going to be judgmental against me. And he's really talking about it in the third person, which seems to waste a lot of time because at the end, DeLacy seems to be super sympathetic towards him, and he takes so long saying it, that Felix comes back in, and Agatha and Safi. And it doesn't go well, which is really heartbreaking because you can see how long the creature has just like watched them like wanting their companionship. But he sort of breaks down. He senses that he hears them coming back. He throws himself onto DeLacy and like begs him for friendship, which is clearly threatening to the other three. So Agatha faints. Safi, unable to attend to her friend, rushed out of the cottage. Felix darted forward and with the supernatural force tore me from his father, to whose knees I clung. He dashed me to the ground and struck me violently with a stick. I could have torn him limb from limb, as the lion rends the antelope. but my heart sunk within me as with bitter sickness, and I refrained. So finally he escapes back to his hovel, which we might assume he's not going to stay for much longer. Okay, I meant to go over that more quickly. I always do, but it always takes about 20 minutes. So that's the chapters. I hope you guys enjoyed these chapters. They're my favorite. But I like the next ones too. The next chapters, I'm not sure how far you have to read, but we'll continue with the creatures narration, which is my favorite. And I find it's a little easier to understand than both Robert Walton and Victor Frankenstein. Okay, hopefully you guys made it through this. You have a good understanding of these chapters. We're going to talk about them in the future. Okay, bye guys.